Speaker.
I call the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I say that on this occasion I do agree with the Government and Trevor Mallard as to process. The bill that we are coming to consider today does not deal with how the Governor-General is appointed. Now, there is considerable merit in what Keith Locke has put forward as ideas as to how the appointment process could be improved for the appointment of the Governor-General, but it's not for this bill. And indeed, it's also fair to say to Mr Locke that there were similar submissions made in respect of the bill when it went to the Government Administration Select Committee on which I was serving. And the clerk of the committee provided advice to the committee that amendments to that effect were beyond the scope of the bill, because the bill doesn't deal with methods of appointment. Now, I would like to just describe further my concerns about process. And I'm not a process junkie, but I do recognise that some of the long-established processes that we have in this Parliament are to protect against substantial changes being made that might not properly be thought through. I'm not accusing Mr Locke of not having properly thought this through. I'm actually taking the principal point. There are various ways in which our select committees are meant to act as a check on what happens in this Parliament. This is all the more important in New Zealand because we have a unicameral Parliament. If this Parliament gets it wrong, there is no higher house to which legislation or through which a higher house passes that can check on it and turn things back if we make mistakes. And that's why in New Zealand we are very, very reliant on the scrutiny of legislation which is proposed on the select committee process. And there are a number of ways in which that can be usurped to the detriment of the interests of New Zealanders, and one is by putting things into legislation at select committee that are beyond the scope of the bill. Why do we oppose that? Because people don't have an opportunity to submit on them. If it's not within the scope of things that are originally in the bill, then interested New Zealanders who might have a view in favour or against the sort of thing that Keith Locke is now proposing don't have the chance to submit upon it and tell the committee, and therefore through the committee, this Parliament, what are the pluses and what are the minuses of the proposal. And as Annette King has just said, and that's the next issue that I was going to go to, that if we agree to this, Mr Locke, then how are we to resist inappropriate attempts by the government to do similar things in respect of their legislative agenda when they want to tack on to pieces of legislation that have gone to select committee and then come back to this House, or indeed do it at select committee, which we would disagree with as an opposition. And there are already, in my opinion, too many things that are being done to undermine the effectiveness of some of these processes, the open government that we have in New Zealand. Electoral finance legislation, we've had Jackie Dean. Well, Jackie Dean, electoral finance legislation is actually probably quite a good case in point, because that did go through a full select committee process. Through a full select committee process, no truncated process there. The rule of the government now seems to be to use their numbers to change the reference to select committee by truncating the period for the select committee, truncating the period for public submission at select committee. They did it for the Super City, a phrase that I don't like, but the Auckland City reorganisation legislation, they did that for that. They've done it for other legislation. They've used urgency inappropriately. The government has used urgency repeatedly inappropriately. They've used that to effectively push legislation through different stages in a very truncated period of time, which again stops the fourth estate, stops the opposition, stops interest groups getting up opposition to policy that could be opposed over a longer period of time to proper effect so as to protect New Zealanders against inappropriate change. Another example is the Official Information Act.
Order. Could I just advise the member of Standing Order 83. This is a procedural motion. It is a narrow debate. The only matter under debate is whether the committee should have the power to examine and adopt the supplementary order paper. That is the only matter for debate. And what may or may not have gone on before could be very interesting. but is prescribed for this debate. I just invite the House... Excuse me. I just invite the House to remember that it's a narrow debate about whether or not the Select Committee should or should not have the power to consider this. Point of order, Keith Locke.
Mr Speaker, I seek leave to table a submission to the Select Committee presented by Lewis Holden and Dean Knight, specifically proposing the two measures...
Order. I'd say to the member that the kawa of this House is that for those sorts of procedural motions or things should be done at the end of a person's speech. The Honourable David Parker is speaking. I have pulled him up on a matter of order. I want the Honourable David Parker to be given the opportunity to complete his speech, and when he is finished, the member is welcome to take a point of order at that point. Just a courtesy to the members who are speaking.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And indeed, Mr Locke is correct that a similar submission was made to Select Committee, and that's the reference that I was making earlier to the advice that we had in relation to just that suggestion was that it was beyond the scope of the bill. And the instances, Mr Speaker, that I was talking to were why we should take care not to agree in this procedural motion to take a step that effectively undermines the protections that we normally have in this House against inappropriate process. And I was giving instances of that. And the only other one that I would give, sir, is in respect of how the Official Information Act can be constrained and indeed how minority reports can be blocked by the government. All of these sorts of things are encouraged if we vote for this motion, because this motion actually suggests that we should put aside the normal processes, we should ignore what is normally within the scope of the bill, we should ignore our parliamentary traditions which go to open government, to Official Information Act, to Select Committee length periods, to minority reports, to agreeing to things that are only within the scope of the bill. So, Mr Speaker, for those reasons, although I think there is considerable merit in the idea that we should move to a more transparent and process for the appointment of the Governor-General. I mean, the Governor-General ought to be appointed with the support of this House rather than just with the support of the government. And indeed, I think governments through the years have tried to make appointments that are appealing to both sides of the House. So I have no problem with the substance that this is behind the amendment, behind the motion, because that would just be putting a process or writing down a process that would ensure that there is some cross-party agreement as to the future appointment of Governor-Generals or Governors-General. But in terms of the process point, we in the Labour Party are going to take the proper process point here. We are feeling that the government currently is taking advantage of us at select committees, and we don't want to give them cause to be able to do so by agreeing to an inappropriate process motion here. So, Mr Speaker, the position of the Labour Party is that we oppose this motion. Mr Speaker, these procedural motions do appear on their face to be rather dry things that you think that, well, there's not much harm in that. But I think when we think through the underlying issues here, there are important matters of principle and precedent. So I've mentioned the principles, but the precedent effect would be of concern to the Labour Party, and I would suggest would be of general concern to the Greens often, because as Trevor Mallard has said, the Greens often take the process point, and often appropriately. I have to say that the Greens during the last the only 2 terms of the Labour government when I was here often stopped us using shortcut processes because they controlled whether we could get a majority with those shortcut processes, and they stopped us doing it. And at times it was a bit frustrating for us when we were in government. But actually, I look back there and I compare that with what happens now under the national government, and I think that the Greens were right, and that these processes ought to be protected, because the way in which we consider legislation in this House has been built up through precedents for over 100 years, and those precedents are born of experience as we try and protect New Zealand against inappropriate lawmaking. And so inappropriate lawmaking can be caused by hasty lawmaking or by agreeing to matters that are essentially beyond the scope of the bill, and this is beyond the scope of the bill.